Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us today. You're welcome to this session called Navigating the Minefield, Data and Strategies for Protecting Civilian and Humanitarians from Explosive Hazards. This panel brings together some perspectives on explosive violence from a global perspective, on civilian harm, to specific humanitarian exposure, and finally, to operational realities from the field. So we'll not explore only what is happening, but also how data can help us better understand and respond to these risks. So please let me briefly introduce us. First, we have Niamh Gillen. She's an explosive violence researcher at Action on Armed Violence, and she will be presenting on global civilian harm trends related to mines, IEDs, and unexploded ordnance. Second, we are joined by Simon Tyler. He's the head of the Europe office at Halo Trust, and he will bring an operational perspective from the mine action world. And finally, myself, I'm Mariana Duque Diez. I'm a research associate at Humanitarian Outcomes, and I'll present findings from the aid worker security database based on humanitarian exposure to explosive hazards. So let's begin with Niamh's presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Niamh Gillen. I'm an explosive violence researcher at Action on Armed Violence, a London-based charity which investigates civilian harm caused by explosive violence. Within my presentation, I'll be looking at the themes, trends and global patterns of mines, IEDs and UXOs across the last decade, from 2016 to 2025. I'll be taking this data from our explosive violence monitor, which captures civilians and armed actors killed or injured by explosive weapons globally, and this has been running since 2010. And on Monday, we are launching our annual report for 2025. Just to note that mines and IED data are included in our annual report, but UXO data is not. But however, we still record this data in our monitor and are happy to share this with anyone who may be interested. And this is just an image of our annual report for 2025. It goes into depth about the findings of global explosive violence patterns in 2025, examining specific weapon types, countries and trends we identified throughout 2025. You'll be able to access the full report on our website on Monday. So a quick overview. Explosive hazards continue to cause civilian harm in both active and post-conflict settings. The three main types which I'll be discussing today are mines, IEDs, and unexploded ordnance. We categorize each weapon type differently within our monitor, and therefore I'll be presenting them separately, looking at the patterns and risks posed by each. I also want to mention that our use of the word casualty is referring to both deaths and injuries. So a quick comparison of each category with the harm caused to civilians and percentage of civilians harmed within populated areas. Here you can see that civilian harm constitutes 41% of total harm recorded by mines, with half of civilian casualties occurring in populated areas. Civilian casualties accounted for 70% of all harm caused by IEDs, and over 90% of this harm took place within a populated area. Lastly, civilians accounted for 94% of civilian harm caused by UXOs, with nearly 70% occurring in a populated area. So this is just a graph to show the yearly distribution of civilian casualties caused by mines, IEDs and UXOs over the last decade. Civilian harm from IEDs has decreased largely over the decade, and the same with civilian casualties of mines, but the civilian harm caused by UXOs has increased between 2024 and 2025. This is largely due to the fact that active mines in Syria and other post-conflict contexts are now being reported and recorded in our dataset as UXOs, therefore impacting the overall trend of civilian harm caused by the two types. So now we're going to look more specifically at mines. So I'll be referring to mines here within active conflict. So between 2016 and 2025, AOAV recorded around 2,155 mine incidents, causing over 3,000 civilian casualties, accounting for 41% of total casualties from mines within the decade. We recorded mine incidents in 41 countries, and 35% of these incidents occurred within a populated area. Within a populated area. Notably, 50% of civilian casualties from mines occurred within a populated area. The 5 worst impacted countries were Syria, Myanmar, Ukraine, Yemen, and Pakistan. It also is important to know that the threat of such weapons is not necessarily decreasing. As I said, in contexts such as Syria, landmines are now described as UXOs, and therefore this decrease in civilian harm can be deceiving. So in terms of perpetrators, according to our data, the largest within our data has largely been by actors of unknown name and status, followed by non-state actors and then state actors. The same trend follows within the patterns of civilian harm. In terms of non-state actors, the key known perpetrators of civilian harm from mines were the Houthis, Islamic State and affiliated organizations, and Al-Shabaab. In terms of state actors, the key known perpetrators were Russia, Myanmar, and Iran. So this is just a visual of the countries impacted by mine use, and they are highlighted in red. This is just a graph to illustrate the most impacted locations in terms of mine use, with villages being the worst affected, followed by locations with no information given, roads, urban residential areas, agricultural land such as farms, and locations coded as other. It's also important to note that 50% of casualties occurred within a populated area such as these. I'll now move on to IEDs. So IEDs were the worst of the weapon categories that I'm discussing today. Over the past decade, IEDs have continued to pose a substantial and lethal threat to civilians. We've recorded over 10,000 incidents of IED use between 2016 and 2025, representing 21% of total attacks during the last decade. 70% of all casualties from IEDs were civilians, and civilian casualties from IEDs accounted for 24% of total harm caused by all explosive weapons. We also recorded IED use in 93 countries around the world, with 55% of IED incidents occurring in a populated area where civilians are likely to be present, and 91% of civilian casualties from IEDs occurring within a populated area. So despite the decreasing usage, the harm still remains prominent. In terms of perpetrators, as expected, non-state actors have caused the majority of civilian harm from IEDs, accounting for 93% of civilian casualties and 97% of all incidents from IEDs. The key known non-state perpetrators were the Islamic State and affiliated organizations, the Taliban, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram. However, it should be noted that the Taliban's use of IEDs is referring to earlier in the decade, with the last recorded use by them being in 2021, according to our data. And here again is a map just to illustrate the 93 countries impacted by IED use. They are highlighted in red, and this is just under half the world. The 5 countries most impacted throughout the decade were Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Somalia. And it's worth noting that the majority of IED use within these countries is carried out by anti-government insurgencies, as well as in the context of sectarian and religious violence. And in terms of location, as I mentioned previously, 91% of civilian casualties occurred within a populated area, which we categorize as follows. The most impacted being as urban residential areas, roads, markets, places of worship, among the others listed. Populated areas are continuously targeted by IEDs due to the fact that large numbers of civilians are likely to be present and likely unable to evacuate the area in time, causing maximum harm. And lastly, I will look at UXOs, which again are not included in our annual report data, but are still a key component of our explosive violence monitor. So overall, between 2016 and 2025, AOAV recorded over 3,000 UXO incidents. There was a 144% increase in reported UXO incidents between 2024 and 2025, with 80% of these incidents occurring in Syria in 2025. Civilians accounted for 94% of casualties caused by UXOs within the decade. We recorded UXO incidents in 72 countries, with 63% of incidents occurring in a populated area and 68% of civilian casualties occurring within a populated area. And then again, this is just a map just to illustrate the 72 countries which are impacted by UXO use, and they are again highlighted in red. So in terms of the most impacted locations for UXOs, these were villages, urban residential areas, locations with no information given, agricultural land such as farms, and locations marked as other. Specific data on UXO incidents can be hard to find, with many reports being quite vague, hence why we have a category called no information. As mentioned previously, Syria was the worst impacted country for UXOs throughout the decade, with incidents in Syria accounting for 63% of total UXO incidents, with over 25% of these incidents occurring in 2025 alone. The worst impacted regions in Syria were Deir ez-Zor, Aleppo, Idlib, and Hama. And this is just to give an idea of the disproportionate impact on civilians globally. That civilians are still accounting for 94% of casualties from UXOs. This is evidenced further here with the graph showing the number of women and children casualties from UXOs. Children were the worst impacted, accounting for 46% of total civilian casualties, with 52% of child casualties from UXOs being reported in Syria. The reason for this increase in children casualties has been mentioned numerous times over the past few days. And within our research, we read many reports of children being injured when a UXO detonates whilst they're playing with it. Sometimes they bring these objects into their home and they detonate within their houses. Sometimes groups of children are playing with them and they detonate, causing multiple casualties in one incident. These reports appear to be becoming increasingly more common. So in terms of the 10 most impacted countries by UXOs, as expected, Syria was the worst by far, followed by Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Pakistan, India, Myanmar, Ukraine, Cambodia, and Nigeria. Due to time constraints, I won't go into further detail on each country, but I'm happy to share our data with anyone who may be interested. So I also just wanted to give a quick overview of the types of UXOs that we're seeing in our monitor. Landmines were the most recorded, followed by unspecified UXOs, mortars, grenades, rockets, and shells. We record the most data as expected in Syria in terms of UXO use, and these are largely landmines. I also wanted to add that the data we record tries to distinguish between actively used mines and UXO mines, but we can only record what the source specifies. So in conclusion, I hope I've given a picture of civilian harm caused by these three types of explosive ordnance. Civilian harm from explosive hazards is not one single problem, with each weapon type continuing to kill and injure civilians, both during and long after conflict ends. Each weapon type contaminates land, restricts livelihoods, and disproportionately impacts civilians. We need to be careful with the data due to definitions which may impact trends for explosive ordnance, but ultimately the impact on civilians remains the same. Overall, there is a downward trend from mines and IEDs in recent years in terms of overall civilian harm, but an increase in UXO harm, which illustrates the prevailing issue. Whilst this downward trend for IEDs and mines can appear reassuring, there is still a long way to go to ensure civilians are no longer harmed by explosive ordnance. And here is a question for you to consider during the rest of the presentation, which we'll come back to at the end. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how data sets such as ours can better support your work. I've focused on civilian harm caused by these weapons, and my colleague Mariana will now look more specifically at the impact of such weapons on humanitarian workers. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tuni, for this overview on global harm caused by explosive hazards. And now as she said, I'm going to shift the focus slightly so that I can be talking about a more specific group, which are the humanitarian workers themselves. So first, I'd like to tell you about our organization. So at Humanitarian Outcomes, we are a team of researchers and policy advisors working with humanitarian agencies and donor governments. Our work focuses in understanding how the humanitarian system operates, both in terms of its internal mechanisms and also the broader political environment in which it functions. We cover a wide range of topics inside the humanitarian world, including coordination mechanisms, finance matters, and also security risk management. We are also the owners, and we are better known for our work on the Aid Worker Security Database, or AWSD. And it's a database that has been recording data since 2005 being the most comprehensive global source of information on major attacks against humanitarian personnel. It is publicly available, and it allows users to explore and customize queries across the entire dataset. We are used by different kind of stakeholders, mainly the humanitarian community during the Not a Target campaign in August during the World Humanitarian Day, but also as the official numbers that are used in reports and in speeches, such as the Secretary General speeches that he does, and in the General Assembly, government and policymakers, and as well as other researchers and think tanks that are interested in these matters. And now, before I enter to the data, I would like to tell you a bit about our methodology and codebook, in which we defined aid workers as the employees or associated personnel of non-profit agencies, both national and international, and that provide material and technical assistance in humanitarian relief contexts. That means that we don't include pure religions organizations that work only in development programs, and peacekeeping forces. So what do include? The database record major incidents of deliberate violence affecting aid workers, including killings of aid workers, of course, serious injuries, meaning that they needed medical attention, kidnappings and detentions, meaning situations in which personnel is held for more than 24 hours, and sexual violence. For the purpose of this presentation, we focus specifically on incidents involving explosives, but the thing is that the database is organized around the attack or incident as the primary unit of analysis. So this means that explosives are captured as parts of means of attack category, which is not the primary way we organize data. And it's also important to say that explosives, it's not a single category among our data, but it includes landmines, body-borne IEDs, vehicle-borne IEDs, roadside IEDs, and other explosive devices. And it's also important, very important to notice that in our database, we don't include incidents affecting staff during active demining operations. So that creates a difference in what we will see, for example, in what Niv's presented and what I'm going to show. And here is also where we can start seeing the challenges working with data across humanitarian contexts. Because when we compare codebooks and methodologies, we find that phenomena which might be similar in practice are often categorized differently across datasets or vice versa. And this is precisely the case when we compare the analysis that Niv did and the one that I'm presenting. So now, let's explore more in depth what the AWSD has to say about explosive hazards. So if we begin with the geographic distribution of incidents, there is a clear pattern that emerges. And it's that a small number of contexts account for the majority of aid worker victims. Here we can see 3 contexts standing out very clearly, which are Somalia, Syria, and Afghanistan. Somalia records the highest overall number of victims, indicating a particular high level of exposure to explosive violence affecting aid workers, while Syria follows closely. But what is more notable here is that it is relatively balanced distribution between fatalities and injuries. This suggests a more sustained and consistent pattern of exposure over time, rather than an isolated high-impact incident. And Afghanistan, by contrast, shows a different profile with a higher proportion of injuries relative to fatalities, and that can reflect a difference in the nature of attacks, operational environments, or even access to medical care. At the same time, we see that there is a sharp drop after the top few countries that show that risk is highly concentrated geographically. Then, when we move at trends over time, we observe a peak between 2017 and 2020 with the highest number of victims in 2019. After this peak, there is a decline, followed by a partial increase again in recent years, and this can help us to see to have two observations. First, that the relationship between fatalities and injuries varies over time, and that the pattern is not linear. So it reflects fluctuations in conflict intensity, operational environments, and possibly reporting dynamics, which means that volatility can be understood itself as a key finding. Then, when we disaggregate incidents by means of attack, there is one pattern very clear that we can observe, and it's that IEDs dominate in our database. In particular, vehicle-borne IEDs and roadside IEDs. These are the ones that account for most of the incidents. We can partially understand that landmines are present, but not that frequent because we do the exclusion of on-duty demining personnel in the AWSD. And it also reinforced the idea that explosive violence is actually composed of multiple distinct tactics, each with different implications for humanitarian operations. To complement this analysis, I would like to use ACLED data, which is another partner to whom we do cross-check information. And I want to use it because it's very interesting to look at well as the spatial distribution incidents. So what stands out here is a strong clustering in the Horn of Africa and in the Middle East, that confirms the concentration observed in the AWSD data. However, at this point, it is important to address a methodological challenge, which is that AWSD and ACLED, as well as AOAV, classify explosives differently. And this creates a real complexity for analysis of data because the categories are not directly comparable. But at the same time, this is also an opportunity because by working across data sets, we can cross-check patterns, validate findings, and identify inconsistencies. So that's why it's very important to compare multiple data sources when you are working with data, and we are working with data. And that's also why at AWSD we are strong advocates for having open and publicly available data so that everyone can do these comparisons and find inconsistencies and understand what data really means. So when we do that, we really can strengthen the robustness of analysis and can help us avoid relying on a single perspective. Now, to finish, I would like to briefly highlight a recent publication that it's closely connected to the theme that we have been discussing, because even if we work on data, we always try to make this data useful and practical for the people that work on operations. And so here with the Good Practice Review 8 or GPR 8, we have been working on how to create comprehensive resource addressing how humanitarian organizations understand and manage risk. Back in the days, it was like the first resource for security risk management, and in this third edition, we have revisited the work to reflect evolving realities on the ground, including, of course, the emergence of new threats and hazards that affect humanitarian personnel. This edition is a result of a collaborative effort bringing together a wide range of specialists across different areas of security risk management. And to make the content more accessible, we have also developed a microsite, an interactive microsite that it's available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic, and where you can download each chapter individually. In particular, the chapter number 7 focuses on specific threats and risks, and within it, the section 7.10 addresses combat-related threats and remnants of war. And in this section, of course, we include include a discussion on explosive hazards, directly linking to the issues that we are exploring today. So the chapter brings together expertise from organizations working at the operational level, including Trokea, Mercy Corps, and the Mines Advisory Group, in collaboration with Humanitarian Outcomes. And the aim, of course, is to bridge that gap between data analysis and practice so that we can provide better guidance that is grounded both in evidence and field experience. So to conclude, I would like to pose a question on you, just as Niv did before, so that we can discuss this at the end of the session. So my question is, what factors encourage or discourage your organizations from both using existing data and reporting their own incidents? And now I will hand over to Simon, who will bring a field-based perspective on mine and operational realities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to be leaving this up. My name is Simon Tiller. I'm the head of Halo Europe. I've been with Halo since 2022 after a forced displacement from my post in Ukraine when the full-scale war happened. But before that, I spent 8 years walking around minefields, through minefields, as part of 2 field missions with the OSCE. And as a ceasefire monitor in Ukraine, and before that in Armenia and Azerbaijan. When I thought about presenting to you and talking to you, the first thing I think we need to acknowledge is that we live in difficult times. And I think without getting into too much detail, there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about in terms of the context. I think it's very important to acknowledge that war and armed violence are more and more seen as a legitimate approach to conflict resolution. There is a great weakening of multilateral institutions and a weakening of adherence to international humanitarian law in armed conflict. There seems to be a lot of transactional geopolitical approaches, which harken back to the 19th century. Humanitarian budgets are being raided to increase defense spending, which is particularly worrying, I think, for the long run. And the problems are getting worse. More landmines are being laid, certainly more than we can pull up out of the ground. And donors seem to also be prioritizing acute conflicts, conflicts that are in the news, but that means that those conflicts are being prioritized at the expense of what we call forgotten conflicts, and particularly completion countries, countries whose conflict journey, may be quite well developed, but where there is still residual contamination. And of course, if we go to acute conflicts, those tend to be in more unstable environments, which means that they're more costly to service. Halo itself, for example, when it started out, was only working in post-conflict environments. Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Zimbabwe, and now we see more and more that donors are asking us to work in conflicts that are ongoing. So conflict where armed violence exists now. And as a result of that, it becomes much more difficult for us to work there. We have to think a lot more about the security for staff. We have to be ready to withdraw at any moment. We have to be able to consider what would happen in Ukraine, for example, if there was the use of a tactical nuclear weapon all of a sudden. What would that mean for our operations, etc. After the attack on the Danish Refugee Council in Ukraine, for example, which was not only it was acknowledged by the Russian Federation Armed Forces. They even showed video footage of the site before they attacked it and the incident of the attack, and so now we have to park our cars in a kind of a not normal way. We would normally park our cars next to each other, but that could be misinterpreted as us being some armed group or something like this. So we have to park no more than 4 cars together, and we have to park them a bit more haphazardly. So we can see immediate impacts on the kind of the way that we work, and it requires us to constantly be reviewing our standard operating procedures. But back to the context. As a result of these things that are happening, more war, less money, more defense money, less humanitarian aid, I can tell you that HALO itself is planning for a 30% reduction in income this year. And since I joined in 22, we've reduced our staff by 40%. I don't think many people really understand the seriousness of that, because what it means is effectively everything that we try and do, the timelines are pushed back. And this means that the number of places that have mines and our ability to service communities and to remove these risks is extended into the future. Hence the title of the presentation. I met last week a Finnish member of European Parliament who himself is a retired Major General, and he told me that the last occupying soldier left Finland in 1945, but it took the last victim, the last casualty of mines that were laid during the Second World War was in 2013. So almost 70 years it took Finland. And Finland is a country with a lot of resources, a modern country, a country that takes the protection of its civilians extremely seriously, and that has all kinds of, access to resources and economic resources. And it took Finland 70 years to clear its mines. So when you look at other conflict contexts like Somalia or Myanmar, where there isn't that level of development or money, then you can imagine what the harvest is like, what the story that we can tell to communities that have been affected by armed violence. I want to mention really quickly now the benefit of data-driven approaches in acknowledgement of my colleagues here who've made really excellent presentations. And I think data-driven approaches, they reassure donors that we're providing value for money. They ensure humanitarian principles are kept at the forefront. We're looking to save as many lives as possible. They allow us to make the case for forgotten conflicts. Myanmar is not really in the news. Zimbabwe is not really in the news. It keeps international attention across the world. And it also helps us to measure change and provide feedback. And this is also extremely important. We need some objective truth in this world. But there is a caveat, two caveats really. The data can be questioned, so it needs to be transparent, and the definitions need to be made clear, which I think both of your organizations do a really good job of doing. But also an acknowledgement that data can be used for propaganda, political propaganda purposes. And certainly in my experience, I found that officials love to they have an interest in overstating the size of the problem, because it gets them more attention, it gets them more resources, it puts them in the headlines, it enables them to show that their suffering is a method by which they can attract attention and resources. Or they may be tempted to understate the problem, because this would show how much progress they're making. This would also help to build their reputation as a competent actor in terms of how they're dealing with the problem. And we've seen both of these things in Ukraine, for example. So HALO works in 8 of the 10 worst impacted areas from the data in terms of UXOs and IEDs. Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Myanmar, Ukraine, Cambodia, Nigeria, and 7 of the 10 most fragile and conflict-affected countries according to World Bank terminology. So this is encouraging. I think it shows that humanitarian needs are being put first in terms of the communities we serve, and that we're deploying to some of the hardest and most complex and most unstable contexts that there are on this planet. And that leads us with a difficult understanding of how we can manage the risks that are inherent in working in these contexts. Now, what does it mean for our staff? What does it mean for the communities that we serve? One thing I would like to say is that we recruit from conflict-affected communities, and we always have done. So over 95% of all of HALO staff are conflict-affected community members. The work that we do entails risk. We call it dangerous gardening. And we have a lot of ways of mitigating those risks. We have standard operating procedures, we have the IMAS regulations, we have good discipline and training, we have all kinds of ways of mitigating that. But the context also entails risk. And the risk could be that we could become victims of the armed conflict. Often there's a lack of decent medical facilities or infrastructure. For example, the road network is very poor, leading to road traffic accidents, which in a way, I think road traffic accidents is the major cause of injury among our staff and of beneficiary communities as well. There's environmental degradation in a lot of these fragile and conflict-affected contexts. There are more natural hazards, there are more extreme weather events. There are unstable governments, which means there might be the presence of armed group or contested territories, state formation conflicts, and the rule of law is weaker, so there might be more crime. And then also there's psychological impacts of conflicts, which impact on our international staff and our local staff. Levels of stress. There's also, where there is violence, the availability of weapons also means that sometimes the incidents of violence become more acute. And this is in a way the harvest of the conflict that we have psychologically. We know that people who grow up in or live in conflict contexts, they suffer from psychological problems, they suffer from poor health, and they suffer from even educational outcomes are compromised by a life living in conflict zones. So in conclusion, the title, As You Sow, So Shall You Reap, it's very biblical. We started our work in Afghanistan 38 years ago, and we've cleared maybe half of the contaminated land. I think now 4 million people, Afghani citizens, live on Halo-cleared land. And this is taking a really long time. And I think to myself sometimes, what is it that we can tell families who've been displaced as a result of the conflict in Ukraine? If we tell them, like the Finnish example, that it will take 70 years to clear this land, it means that they won't be able to return. Their children won't be able to return. Their grandchildren won't be able to return. But maybe their great-grandchildren will be able to return to their lands. The land that we live on is very much part of our identity. And I think if we break that, then we also increase the psychological toll of the conflict on the people that live there as well. I think our responsibility collectively, and I see us all as colleagues, all of us are colleagues in this endeavor, to try and minimize the psychological impact on conflict. We owe it to the people who have to live with these weapons of war to work faster, to focus on clearance, to get rid of the problem. It's a finite problem. It's growing, but it's finite. We need to hand over land as quickly as possible to civilian control, to allow people to return. We need to link humanitarian mine action and clearance, explosive ordnance risk disposal, to other sectors as well, to the health sector, to economic recovery, to the peace-building sector. And finally, we need to embrace technology to increase productivity. And I think that's all I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention, and we're here for questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. This was very insightful. So now we would like to open the floor for you to ask some questions, and we would also like to discuss with you these two questions that we have posed before. So we would like to know, first, based on your experience, how can data sets like the AWSD or the one from AOAV or other similar sources, of course, can better support the mine action community in making operational and strategic decisions? Second, what factors encourage or conversely discourage your organizations from both using existing data and reporting their own incidents? And in other words, where do you see the main barriers and also opportunities in strengthening data use and data sharing across the sector? So we have the floor open for discussion. Yes, please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Mariam from the ICRC. Actually, I have two questions, please. One for the colleague from AOAV and one for Humanitarian Outcomes. For AOAV, My question is, in one of the, I think it was related to landmines, you were measuring incidents in active conflicts only. My question is, what's the criteria for, where do you draw the line in active conflicts? Because in some cases it's blurry. For ICRC, we identify around 130 active conflicts these days in around 60 countries. So just wondering where the criteria is for you. And for humanitarian outcomes, my question to you is whether and how you include casualties involving staff and volunteers from Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies, so Sudanese, Lebanese, in Gaza and so on, because there's a few notable incidents in the last few years that I'm not sure they look like they made it into the statistics, but I'm not sure if you classify them as health workers or some other category. So thank you very much, and thank you also for addressing this issue, because as organizations we have this duty of care towards our staff, but we don't always give it as much attention as it needs. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. It is a bit difficult in terms of working out active and post-conflict settings. With landmines, we go off what the source says. So if it describes it as a legacy or a UXO, we will put UXO. And obviously that would be usually in a post-conflict setting. And if it says landmine, then within that data it's usually referring to an active setting, but it could technically be in a post-conflict setting as well. That's just based on our methodology, going off of what the source says. But we do take that into consideration when analysing the data. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. So usually we have different ways of getting the information, both from public and then private partnerships that we have. And we have a very strong verification process with most of the biggest, and we are now trying to strengthen our work with national organizations that do humanitarian work. So in the case that you are mentioning, we have a direct partnership implemented with IFRC, in which they yearly send us the incidents that national societies have had all across the world. And then we have some strong links to some specific societies, such as the Lebanese and the Palestinian one, that are specifically categorized as under CS in our database. So we have, in terms of the actor that was affected, we have the UN system, INGOs, national NGOs, and we have separately the national societies and the ICRC, because of the specific partnership that we have with these organizations. So we hope and we trust that what IFRC sent to us, it's exactly what happens in each context, and so that we can have really reliable information. Thank you. Any other question or comment about our questions for you? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Chiara from Mine Action Training Kosovo. Thank you very much for some really insightful presentations. My question is for Niamh, and it's kind of also touching on that first discussion point that you've got up on the board. I was wondering, in the data set now, what weapon types are currently or have recently been dominating or trending upwards, and therefore what weapon types are likely to form the core of upcoming and future explosive ordnance disposal challenges? Because that's one of the ways we would use these data sets, right? It's to prepare our responses and make sure that we've got conflict preparedness in mind as well as responsiveness. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara, for your question. In our data and in the 2025 annual report, and 2024 as well, and I'm sure in the years before as well, air-launched weapons have been increasing hugely. That can also include airdropped IEDs, and I guess that could be a future UXO. The main kind of discussion we've been having is that today's, I guess, explosive weapon is tomorrow's UXO, which is what you're saying. So yeah, I would say air-launched is probably the worst, and that's airstrikes, missiles, all of that. And they do come up as well, but the sources aren't. It's usually landmines, but that's also due to accessibility of sources. It doesn't mean that that's actually what's happening everywhere, that's just what we're coming across. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, Niv, and thank you, Kara, for your question. Any other question or comment on? Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you so much for all this valuable information. My name is Murat. I'm from Turkish Ministry of Defense. In 2018, I had a chance to work as a liaison officer in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And one of our missions over there was conducting trainings for the civilians, especially for the children, to raise their awareness against this threat. So I can just add a little thing at the end of this valuable meeting. There's a strong correlation between the awareness of civilians and the incidents at the end. So we saw that we used to conduct trainings, as I said, and we used to take records. And the next month we used to plan to which schools, to which villages we should go and continue our trainings. And you know, you have to refresh this from time to time. And at the end, with little, very liaison and observation team records, we saw that there's a correlation between the trainings. Less training area, more incidents. And this is the some conclusion of the service that I saw on the reports before me, and as I could follow after my service. I can just tell you this very obvious and very easy, basic thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and that's very insightful, precisely because understanding how we can impact in different ways, both training, both showing data, and it's a way to, in practice, protect civilians and humanitarian workers as well in conflict-affected zones. Yes, please.
My name is Vasant, working with ICRC in Yemen. I just want to highlight the collection of the data barriers that we face. So it's not super easy to collect data. The access to data is very difficult, and it goes through lots of sensitivity, national security, and using the tools and getting verified by the authorities. It's a great barrier for us. And also the civilian incidents are not very well verified, the information, the accuracy, and the triangulation of the data also difficult in Yemen. But we highly rely on ACLED and the civilian impact project monitoring. There's a UN-based data collection. It's a third-party open source. So these are the data sets we highly rely on for the better informed decision making for the mine action activities there, especially with incidents and casualties. So this helps us to plan, prioritize the locations. And also this is a highlight for Yemen, and a question like if you are collecting data with Yemen, with whom you contact, or it's verified sources you are getting from Yemen. So what kind of difficulties are you facing? So that's some questions to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do you want to comment, Niv?
Thank you for your question. In terms of Yemen, we don't collect the most in Yemen. I'm pretty sure more will be happening than what we collect. But we do, it comes up quite often, but not in comparison to other countries. So there's probably an underreporting just due to sources. Again, we only rely on English language media. So if a source is reporting in Arabic or another language, then we can't use it. We have been having discussions about expanding our languages, just because obviously English can be a bit limiting. We've got blind spots because of that. But it's kind of a question of funding capacity and all of that stuff. And it's the same with our accessibility to the data. We would love to have a dashboard where our data can be accessed by everyone, especially field workers, to kind of inform their decision making. But again, it comes down to capacity and funding. And we are discussing it, and we hope that it's possible. And we happily send out our data to anyone anytime they ask. It's just not readily available as other data sets are, which is unfortunate, but we hope that we can change that soon. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, Niv. And in our case, so since we we collect some incidents from public sources, but we also have this arrangement with most of the biggest INGOs and all the UN system. So what happens is that usually when they report, they have to report from national offices to their headquarters, and then we get the information from the headquarters directly, usually completely anonymized, because we are not interested in the name of the victim or any particularities, just to know about the incident as the main category of analysis. We also, from time to time, try to engage with a specific country coordination forums. And in the case of Yemen, for example, we have engaged with both, because we know that you have two different coordination bodies because of the dynamic of the conflict there and how they engage with different authorities. So we have talked to both coordination bodies, INGO coordination bodies, to get like some incidents or reports that they have. But we understand that there are a lot of limitations for them to give us that information, even if it's completely anonymized and everything, because of the dynamic. That's also why we just launched. We don't publicly like do the publicize this information, but we also created a specific button on our website in which a person can anonymously report if they had an incident, and they don't have to mention like from which organization or whatever, just like provide very general data of what happened, and then we can include it so that we can protect. Maybe someone doesn't feel comfortable about something with their organization, and they can report to us. So these are the different ways that we try to tackle. But of course, as Nif say, we're pretty sure that there are some blind spots, or that we don't have like all the incidents. In Yemen, for example, this is not the case from explosive hazards, but we are struggling a lot with data about detentions. And it's very difficult to confirm if it's more than 24 hours, if the organization considers it a detention or not, and all these things. Yes, Simon?
We've also tried with some donors to scrape social media sites for reports of incidents or photographs of incidents. And we found, for example, that this gives us a different view on what the situation is. In Ukraine, for example, the State Emergency Service will only log an incident if they are called. So they have a log of their own incidents that they attended. But often there's underreporting and other things happen. And we found that our database had 4 times as many casualties as the official statistics. So we are trying to work with the authorities of Ukraine to make this, more widespread, to work with ACLED as well, and to try and INSO as well, to try and get this database more done. And I think we also found, we did something similar in Yemen, and we found, for example, that during the ceasefire, the 6 months of the ceasefire in 2022, the number of accidents went up by about 50%. We're not sure, but it was a huge jump, probably doubled. I think it doubled, because all of a sudden people were starting to move. And they thought it was safe to move because there was a ceasefire, and as a result, the number of incidents went really, really high. And I think this is especially important to know. We found the same problem in Syria, for example, as families return because they want their children to go to school at the beginning of the school year. We have large movements of people in the late summer, and this also creates a spike in accidents as well. So an understanding a little bit of the social movement of peoples, and not to think that a ceasefire means less casualties. It may mean less, active fire incidents, but the number of UXO and mine accidents will tend to spike then as well. Thank you.
So I would like to pose our questions to Simon. Yeah, so that you can, from an operational perspective, tell us which are the enablers or the things that discourage your organization from having a better approach to data and make decisions using that data.
Okay, you've put me on the spot now. So I think data and reality should exist in a sort of a cycle. So we use data in advance to determine what's the most appropriate form of action, and then we need to go back to the data to sort of check what we're doing. And I think there needs to be this kind of iterative process where we use it to plan, but we also use it to check. We use it to propose activity, but we also use it to report back on the impact of that activity. I think that's the best way to do it, and that data needs to be constantly checked, it needs to be constantly looked at, and we need to maintain a critical eye and be wary of propaganda. We need to be aware of the fact that it's very hard. Reality is quite slippery during a conflict. It's very hard to have an objective truth that everyone agrees to. The risk of propaganda is always there, the risk of underreporting, the risk that people aren't able to capture properly what's happening, etc. So it's a difficult problem, but it's worth doing. I think if we just go on gut feeling, we're going to be doing the wrong things, we're going to be putting the money in the wrong place, we're going to be inefficient. And data absolutely has to be an integral part of everything that we do. And I'd just like to commend my two panelists for the work that they're doing, because without this kind of data, it wouldn't be possible to act and react properly in conflict situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And thank you, everyone, because this was a very interesting conversation. Thank you really for joining us in this reflection. And the idea that we had was to have a moment to reflect on how data and field experience complement each other and understand and how can they help us understand explosive hazards, both from global patterns to specific risks and also to operational realities. So thank you very much to all of you and have a good rest of the day.